that if you were a Russian pilot of your Russian aircraft, you'd know that you had complete dominance over Ukraine. Now the West's aircraft are starting to arrive. It'll just sow a seed of doubt in your mind, and that will cause the Russian aircraft to operate just a little bit further back from the front line, and that will take some of the pressure off the front line, because bluntly, in modern warfare, there hasn't been an army that's prevailed without having air cover. Ukraine hasn't had that air cover, and that's one of the reasons why Russia has managed to make progress on the front line. The more that these fast jets, fighter jets, can get into Ukraine's inventory, the more chance they have to present a credible deterrent to Russia. I'm Sean Bell, a former fighter pilot with the Royal Air Force, now a military analyst for a variety of national and international news media. We heard only earlier on this week that the Mirage 2000s have arrived in Ukraine. This is part of an effort to bolster Ukrainians' military capability. The Mirage 2000, it's the 5 variant that's been offered, has been around in service since about 1970. In 1999, the French upgraded it to the 2005, and that's the variant we understand that has been given to Ukraine. It's a single-engine fighter jet. It's got a delta wing. It's a 4th-generation fighter, very capable, and it's got a very, very good radar. There's only been about 600 of these built around the world. About 9 nations use it. We don't yet know how many of the Mirage 5s, Mirage 2000, the 5 model, are going to actually be given ultimately. Part of that is because in the West, we tend to be a little bit seduced by the numbers of aircraft. Whereas as a former fighter pilot, the big problem for Ukraine at the moment is actually just getting pilots trained. It doesn't take a day, a week, a month. It's years worth of training. And there's little point in France forward deploying these Mirage jets into Ukraine. If they don't have the pilots to fly them, they'll just become a target for the Russians. So my understanding is that earlier this week, the first of these aircraft were delivered by Ukrainian pilots into Ukraine itself. And I'd be interested to see what those aircraft are used for and how they bolster Ukraine's defensive capability over the coming days and months. So one of the things that President Zelensky has been very keen to do is to secure support of the West for military capability, initially for artillery shells, anti-tank weapons, then for tanks, then for long-range missiles, but ultimately he needed fighter jets. And the reason for that is that Russia has a much greater quantity and quality of fighter aircraft. When Ukraine left the former Soviet Union, it was left with the sort of dregs of their air force, so was never really able to offer a credible threat to Russia. The problem with offering fighter jets is that even if we were to deliver 200 fighter jets, roughly the number that we believe President Zelensky needs, even if they were to arrive on the lawn outside the presidential palace in Kyiv tomorrow, they wouldn't have the pilots to fly them, they wouldn't have the engineers to service them and the like. And besides, how would they be used? Because Russia has a very sophisticated air defense system along the front line, and Ukraine, bluntly, doesn't have the layered defenses and the coordination to actually operate these jets in a wartime environment. In fact, the first of the F-16s that arrived, if you recall, earlier on last year, the first arrived. We understand there were about a half a dozen of those arrived. We understand that one was shot down by Ukrainian air defense systems. So in other words, it was shot down by their own people, not because they're stupid, just because it's really difficult to coordinate in a very hostile environment. The Russians have lost a huge number of their aircraft to their own air defenses as well. So the likelihood is these jets, these Mirages, they'll be new in theatre, pilots they'll be familiar with the aircraft, but they won't be expert. That takes years of training. What they're probably going to be used for is doing exactly what the F-16s have been doing, which is to shoot down the Russian drones and cruise missiles to provide more defensive capability to Ukraine. And the other element I suspect is that if you're a Russian pilot of your Russian aircraft, you'd know that you had complete dominance over Ukraine. Now the West's aircraft are starting to arrive. It'll just sow a seed of doubt in your mind, and that will cause the Russian aircraft to operate just a little bit further back from the front line, and that will take some of the pressure off the front line, because bluntly, in modern warfare, there hasn't been an army that's prevailed without having air cover. Ukraine hasn't had that air cover, and that's one of the reasons why Russia has managed to make progress on the front line. The more that these fast jets, fighter jets, can get into Ukraine's inventory, the more chance they have to present a credible deterrent to Russia. So how do the Mirages compare to the F-16s? It's a difficult question to answer, because If you look at them from a spotter's perspective, they've both got one engine, they're both supersonic, they're both very agile. I think one of the key, the one challenge that Ukraine has faced is that they've been using the Su-24s to launch our equivalent of Storm Shadow, the long-range missile that's caused such a lot of damage to Russia, because that's a big old missile and there's not many aircraft that are cleared to fly it. The Su-24 is one of them. But Ukraine has suffered huge losses of that platform, and therefore they're running out of aircraft to launch that missile. Now, one thing that F-16 can't do is launch that, whereas the French, because they've got their own version of Storm Shadow called Scalp, their Mirage 2005 is actually cleared to operate that missile. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if that is one discriminator that's a positive step for this Mirage. The downside, I'm afraid, is that Ukraine is not used to operating Western technology, and the whole purpose of having F-16s put into Ukraine was that it's a very widely sold aeroplane. It's the most widely sold around the world. There's lots of models available, lots of spares, lots of expertise. And therefore, you don't really want to be operating a second mark of fighter jets, because that's a different training system. The pilots can't jump from a Mirage into an F-16. There's a different set of spares, a different set of weapons, a different set of engineering support, a different logistics pipeline. That just complicates matters. And the nearest analogy, if you recall, that when we first gave Challenger 2 tanks to Ukraine, we could only give about a dozen of those tanks. That's not really that useful, but what it did do is open the door to Leopard 2s being deployed into theatre, and they've been deployed in significant numbers. The F-16 was given to Ukraine because it's available in significant numbers. It's not entirely clear why the Mirages have been deployed, because it's great to have more aircraft, but my understanding is that I think there's about 96 F-16s committed. The only reason they haven't put money in is they just don't have the pilots yet. So it'll be interesting to see exactly how these Mirages are used. The pilot training for these fighter jets is going to be quite comprehensive. Now, ideally for Ukraine, they need to have a capability early. And that means they want to bring experienced pilots that are already used to flying their Russian equivalent jets, and they bring them across and actually teach them how to fly and operate Western jets. That would create the shortest length of time for training, because they already have a lot of operational experience and are used to whizzing around at supersonic speeds and high G on the battlefield. The problem is that Ukraine has lost a lot of aircraft and a lot of pilots over the years and of this conflict. And the challenge, of course, is that if you take them away from the front line and therefore put them in several months of training, they're not available to fight. So the difficulty has been here. You pull some experienced pilots from Ukraine, but you also put a lot of junior pilots without experience going through the flying training system. And there's been a number of those pilots in the UK learning language training and going through the flying training system. They will take months, if not years, to come out through the system. And that, of course, is not going to help the war today. It is worth setting into context that as a former fighter pilot myself, we've always said that the main aim of the fighters going to Ukraine is not really to have an impact on the war today. What it's actually designed to do is, when the war is over, as it will eventually end, Ukraine will need to have some form of credible air defense system in place. And to start that when you actually end the war would appear to be missing the point. So what the West is trying to do is turn that, create a pool of Ukrainian pilots that are trained to operate Western equipment, Western aircraft, Western weapons, so that come the day when the war is over, they'll much more quickly be able to spin up a credible military capability. President Zelensky doesn't see it like that. He sees that he wants them to be involved in the war today. And of course, there's a limited impact they can have immediately because of the limited numbers. But the positive effect is inevitably that will create a mystique around it all. And the fact that the West, it's a very overt sign. If you see a military jet flying overhead, you don't just see it, you hear it, you feel it. That has a moral component to it as well. And that's probably why President Zelensky is so keen to get these aircraft in as soon as possible. One of the challenges of timing of this is that it's interesting. After nearly 3 years of brutal war fighting, there is this sense at the moment, almost hope, if not expectation, that President Trump's arrival, that the war may be entering its final phase. And of course, what's inevitably going to happen then is there's a look at how do people capitalize and start selling military equipment, military aid, because Ukraine will be desperately keen. They either revert back to their former Soviet Union equipment, unlikely, or they recognize the benefits of Western military equipment, and therefore that's where they flow. And we're already seeing this slight shift at the moment. We're also seeing a shift in terms of money. Up till now, the West has largely given aid to Ukraine. What we've seen now with President Trump, he's doing things much more around a deal. He's talking about stopping aid to Ukraine, but potentially giving them loans. In other words, their business arrangements. And I think what's fascinating here is that President Trump his team have already talked about that Ukraine has a lot of natural mineral wealth underneath the soil in Ukraine. And what President Trump is saying is that, we can start to lend you military equipment, lend you money, as long as we have access to those minerals. And that's fascinating, because you'll know that in the trade wars at the moment that President Trump has started, China has threatened to withhold some of these natural minerals that are absolutely essential for American industry. So all of these events are all intertwined. And I think we're going to see a much more ruthless focus on how do you help Ukraine, but make it much more of a business opportunity than simply donating aid from a lot of countries that are becoming increasingly weary of doing that, because none of them have much spare money available.